Michael, your role is stable. Compensation reflects that. It was 9:10 a.m. when she said it. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock the moment the words landed. Something about hearing the same answer for the third year in a row makes you pay attention to details like that. We were sitting in one of those glass-walled conference rooms. Clean table, neutral chairs, everything designed to feel calm, controlled, like nothing important ever really happens in those rooms. Across from me sat Melissa from HR, calm voice, perfect posture. To her right was Ethan Cole, my manager, early 30s, MBA, sharp suit, the kind of guy who speaks well in meetings but never stays long enough to fix anything. He didn't look at me when she said it. That part stayed with me more than the words. Your role is stable. I had been hearing that phrase for 3 years. Stable. Like the systems I kept running weren't holding together contracts worth millions. Like the clients calling my phone at midnight didn't exist. Like stability was something simple. Something anyone could maintain. Melissa slid a paper across the table. My current salary printed in clean black ink. Same number as last year. Same number as the year before that. No adjustment. No acknowledgement. Just confirmation. We reviewed market data, she continued. And based on your current position, this is aligned. Aligned. I almost nodded. That's the strange part. You sit there, and for a second, you almost agree with them. The tone is so calm, so confident, like the decision was made somewhere far above you, long before you walked into the room. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Not defensive, just steady. I've taken on more responsibility, I said. System oversight, client escalation, weekend coverage. Ethan finally spoke. And we appreciate that, Michael. We really do. He still wasn't looking at me. But compensation isn't just about workload, he added. It's about structure. Structure. That word again. I had heard every version of this conversation. Budget. Structure. Timing. Alignment. Different words. Same outcome. No. I sat there for a few seconds. Not arguing. Not pushing. Just letting it settle. Because at some point, you stop trying to convince people who already decided. My name is Michael Mercer. I'm 47 years old. And at that point, I had spent 13 years inside that company. Senior operations manager. The guy people called when systems failed. The one who stayed late when everyone else went home. The one who fixed problems before they became problems. Stable. That's what they called it. Melissa closed the folder in front of her. We can revisit this next year. Next year. I almost smiled at that. 3 years in a row, and somehow next year always sounded like a real possibility when they said it. Ethan finally looked up, just for a second. We want you to stay, Michael. You're important to the team. Important. Not valuable. Not critical. Just important. I nodded once. Slow. Controlled. Understood, I said. No argument. No emotion. There's a point where you realize the conversation isn't about numbers anymore. It's about how they see you, and how they don't. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and thanked them for their time. Polite. Professional. Exactly the way they expect someone like me to respond. That's the role, too. Not just fixing systems. Managing perception. As I walked out of the room, I caught my reflection in the glass. Same posture. Same calm face. You wouldn't know anything had just shifted. But it had. Because that wasn't just a denial. It was a decision. Not about salary. About value. And the moment you understand how a company values you, everything after that starts to look different. I didn't go back to my desk right away. I just stood there for a second in the hallway. Quiet. Still. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped thinking about what I needed to prove and started thinking about what they were willing to lose. By the time I got back to my desk, nothing had changed. Same screens. Same dashboards. Same quiet hum of systems running in the background. From the outside, my job looked simple. Stable. That word again. But what they called stable was actually something else entirely. It was controlled risk. Every system I managed carried revenue through it. Orders, shipments, client data, billing triggers. If something failed, it didn't just stop work, it stopped money. And most of the time, no one noticed how close things came to breaking. That was my job, not to fix problems, to prevent them from ever being seen. I sat down and pulled up the main operations dashboard. Everything was green, clean, normal. But I knew better. There were always small delays, timing mismatches, data queues building quietly in the background. Nothing big enough to trigger alerts yet, but enough to become a problem if ignored. I opened a secondary panel, then a third. That's where the real work was. The part no one wrote into job descriptions. I had built most of those monitoring layers myself over the years. Simple tools. Nothing fancy. Just ways to see what others couldn't. Because the official systems only showed you what had already failed. I focused on what was about to. Around 11:30, my phone buzzed. Client escalation. One of our larger accounts. Not the biggest, but close. They were seeing delays in processing. Nothing critical yet, but enough to raise concern. I answered on the second ring. Michael here. Relief on the other end. You could hear it immediately. Hey, we've got some inconsistencies in yesterday's batch. I'll take a look, I said. No meeting. No ticket. No escalation chain. Just me. That's how it usually worked. I pulled their data while still on the call. Traced the issue back to a timing offset in one of the internal processes. Small thing. Easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. Give me 10 minutes, I told them. I fixed it in 7. By the time we hung up, everything was back to normal. No report. No record. No one else even knew it happened. That was the pattern. Every day. Problems solved before they reached the surface. Systems held together by decisions no one saw. And above me, presentations. Ethan was good at those. He knew how to speak in clean sentences. Clear slides. Simple narratives. Efficiency improved. Performance stable. Operational strength. I'd seen those decks. Sometimes I even recognized my own work in them. Just not my name. Around mid-afternoon, I passed by one of the conference rooms. Ethan was inside, presenting to senior leadership. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. I already knew what was being said. Metrics. Growth. Stability. All true. Just incomplete. Because none of it explained how close things came to breaking, or who kept them from getting there. That part didn't fit into slides. And over time, I stopped trying to make it fit. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. I knew what I did. I knew what the systems needed. And I knew what would happen if that understanding disappeared. Not immediately, but eventually. That's the thing about systems like ours. They don't fail all at once. They drift. Small gaps. Tiny delays. Minor errors. Until one day, those small things connect. And then everything feels sudden. But never is. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen again. Still green. Still stable. On paper, I had spent 13 years building that kind of stability. Learning patterns. Understanding how different parts of the system reacted under pressure. Knowing which issues mattered and which ones could wait. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from training. It comes from time. From being there when things break. From fixing them when no one else can. And from doing it enough times that you start to see problems before they exist. That was my value. Not the title. Not the salary. The understanding. And the trust that came with it. Clients didn't ask for departments. They asked for me. Not because I was special. Because I was consistent. Reliable. Predictable under pressure. That matters more than most people realize. Especially in systems that carry money. By the time the day ended, everything was still running. No major issues. No visible problems. Just another stable day. That's what they saw. What they didn't see was how much work it took to keep it that way. Or how quickly that stability could disappear if the wrong things were ignored. I shut down my screen slowly. For years, I had taken pride in that. Being the one who kept everything together. But that day, after that meeting, something about it felt different. Not broken, just clear. Like I was finally seeing my role the same way they did. Replaceable. And for the first time, I started wondering what would happen if I stopped proving them wrong. The first time it told me to wait, it sounded reasonable. That was 3 years before that meeting. Back then, the company had just come out of a restructuring phase. Budgets were tight. Departments were shifting. Everyone was adjusting. So when I asked for a raise, they didn't say no. They said, not right now. There's a difference. Let's revisit this next cycle, Michael. You're in a strong position. That's what Ethan told me at the time. And I believed him. Because at that point, I still thought the system worked the way it was supposed to. You do the work. You take on more responsibility. You get recognized. Simple. So I waited. And while I waited, I kept doing what I had always done. Late nights, weekend coverage, fixing things before they escalated, helping new hires understand systems that didn't make sense on paper. One of those hires was a guy named Ryan. Smart, quick learner, fresh MBA. Ethan liked him immediately, put him in meetings early, gave him visibility, let him present updates to leadership. I trained him, showed him where the real issues were, how to read the data beyond the dashboards, what to watch for before something failed. He listened, took notes, asked the right questions. And for a while, I thought that was a good thing, because the more people understood the system, the better it would run. That's what I told myself. 6 months later, we had the next review cycle. I went in prepared. Numbers, results, examples, everything I had taken on since the last conversation. Ethan listened, nodded, agreed with most of it. Then he said, "You've done great work, Michael, but we're still balancing compensation across teams. We need to keep things consistent." Consistent. Another clean word. Another delay. "Let's look at this next year," he added. And just like that, it moved again. No anger. Not yet. Just a quiet shift in expectation. But I kept going, because by then, I was already too invested. A year later, things looked different. The company was doing better. Revenue was up. Clients were expanding contracts. More pressure, more complexity, more work, and somehow more distance between what I did and what was visible. Ryan was leading presentations now, standing in front of leadership, walking through performance metrics. Sometimes I sat in those meetings. Sometimes I didn't. But either way, I knew where the numbers came from. I had built the monitoring layers. I had stabilized the processes. I had handled the failures no one talked about. And then I'd watch him explain it like it was clean, predictable, controlled. That's when I started noticing something. Not just what was being said, but what wasn't. No mention of late-night fixes. No mention of near failures. No mention of the parts that require judgment instead of process. Because those things don't sound good in presentations. They sound like risk. And leadership doesn't like risk. They like stability. Even if that stability is being held together by things they don't understand. The second time I asked for a raise, I was more direct. Same room, same tone, different reason. This year we're aligning roles more tightly, HR said. We want to make sure titles and compensation evolve together. Evolve together. Another delay. Another way of saying, not yet. Ethan added, we're also looking at expanding leadership pathways. There could be opportunities for you there. Opportunities. Future. Possibility. All words that sound like progress, but don't actually change anything. I walked out of that meeting the same way I walked out of the last one. Calm. Professional. Still doing my job. Still carrying the same weight. And somewhere in the middle of that year, something changed. Not outside. Inside. I stopped expecting the next conversation to be different. That's when you start seeing things more clearly. Not emotionally. Logically. You notice who gets visibility, who gets credit, who gets moved forward, and who gets relied on quietly. I realized I wasn't being overlooked. I was being used exactly where I was. Reliable. Consistent. Predictable. That's what made me valuable. And that's what kept me where I was. By the third year, the conversation wasn't even surprising. Different words. Same outcome. And sitting there in that glass room, hearing your role is stable again, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. They weren't waiting to say yes. They had already decided no. And the only thing still waiting was me. After that meeting, I went back to my desk and didn't open anything right away. I just sat there. Same chair. Same screens. Same systems running in the background. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what needed to be fixed next. I was thinking about how much I had been fixing that no one even knew existed. That's a different kind of thought. It doesn't come with anger. It comes with distance. I leaned back and looked at the main dashboard. Everything green. Everything stable. That word again. But now it felt hollow, because I knew what it took to keep it that way. And more importantly, I knew what would happen if I didn't. Not failure. Not immediately. Just exposure. That's the part most people don't understand. Systems don't collapse overnight. They reveal themselves slowly. And the only reason ours hadn't was because I never let it get that far. I caught things early, fixed them quietly, adjusted processes before anyone noticed a pattern. Not because it was written in my role, because I cared about the outcome, about the clients, about the work. That day, something shifted. I didn't decide to stop working. I decided to stop covering. There's a difference. I opened my email and looked at a flag thread from earlier that morning. Minor delay in a batch process. Normally, I would have jumped in immediately, traced it back, fixed it before it became visible. This time, I waited, not ignored, just waited. Let the process run. Let the issue surface the way it was designed to. 10 minutes later, another email came in. Same issue. Now it was visible. Now it was being discussed. I stepped in then. Fixed it the same way I always did. But something about it felt different. Not because the work changed, because the timing did. For years, I had been removing friction before anyone felt it. That day, I let them feel it first. Not as punishment, as reality. I started doing that more often. Small things. Letting alerts trigger before stepping in. Letting minor delays reach the surface before correcting them. Following exactly what was expected. Nothing more. Nothing hidden. At the same time, I started documenting everything. Processes I had kept in my head for years. Workflows that only made sense after you'd seen them fail a few times. Decision points that didn't exist on paper. I wrote them down. Clear. Simple. Accurate. Not because I was planning to leave. Because for the first time, I wasn't assuming I'd always be there. That changes how you work. You stop building around yourself and start separating yourself from the system. Ethan stopped by my desk later that afternoon. "Everything good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "All running." He nodded. "That's what we like to hear." Of course it was. Because as long as things looked stable, nothing else mattered. He didn't ask what it took to keep it that way. He didn't need to. From his perspective, the system worked. That was enough. I watched him walk away and realized something simple. They didn't understand the system. They understood the result. And as long as the result looked clean, they assumed the system was too. That assumption had protected them for years. Because I made it true. That evening, I shut down my screen a little earlier than usual. Not dramatically early. Just on time. I packed my bag, stood up, and took one last look at the dashboard. Still green. Still stable. But now I could see the gaps. The small things building under the surface. The things I used to fix before they became visible. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel anger. Just clarity. I had spent years protecting a system that didn't recognize the protection. And for the first time, I was okay letting it stand on its own. I went home that night knowing something had changed. Not in the company. In me. And once that shift happens, it doesn't go back. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Michael Mercer." I answered. There was a short pause, then a familiar voice. "Michael Eniel, it's Armin. From Crestline Logistics." I leaned back slightly. I hadn't heard that name in over a year. Crestline was one of the larger clients I had worked with directly. Not through sales. Not through account managers. Through problems. Real ones. The kind that don't show up in reports until it's too late. "I remember," I said. He gave a small laugh. "I figured you would." We spoke for a few minutes. Nothing formal at first. Just catching up. He asked how things were going. I gave a usual answer. "Busy. Systems running." Then his tone shifted. "I'm going to be direct," he said. "We're building out a new operations team. Internal. And your name came up more than once." I didn't say anything right away. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. "When we had issues," he continued, "you were the one who actually fixed them. Not explained them. Fixed them." Simple words. But they landed differently than anything I had heard in that conference room earlier that week. "We'd like to bring you in," he said. "Senior role. Full control over systems. And the compensation reflects that." He gave me a number. I didn't react out loud. But I felt it. It wasn't just higher. It was clear. No explanation needed. No alignment discussion. No next year. Just value. "I'll need a day," I said. "Take it," he replied. "But not too long. We're moving fast." We ended the call. I sat there for a few seconds. Same desk. Same screens. Same systems running in the background. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about fixing anything. I was thinking about leaving. Not emotionally. Logically. Because when something outside confirms what you already know inside, it's not really a decision anymore. It's timing. I gave my notice the next morning. 2 weeks. Standard. Professional. Ethan read the email, then walked over to my desk. You're serious? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly. Where are you going? I'll share details later, I said. He didn't push. Okay, he said. We'll make the transition smooth. Smooth. That word again. No counteroffer. No urgency. No pause. Just process. HR scheduled an exit meeting within hours. Same tone as before. Calm. Efficient. Thank you for your contributions, Michael, Melissa said. We'll ensure a clean transition. Clean. I almost smiled at that. Because nothing about what I did was clean. It was layered. Complex. Built over years. But to them, it was just something that could be handed over. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what was expected. No more. No less. I documented everything. Processes. Access points. System flows. Clear instructions. Step by step. If someone followed them exactly, things would work. For a while. But there were things you couldn't write down. Timing instincts. Pattern recognition. The small decisions that only made sense after you had seen the system fail in 10 different ways. That part stayed with me. Not intentionally. It just wasn't something you could transfer in a document. Ryan sat with me a few times during that period. Took notes. Asked questions. Same way he had when he first joined. But this time, something felt different. He was trying to understand something that had taken me years to build. And he didn't have years. He had days. I answered everything he asked. Honestly, clearly, no holding back. But I didn't go beyond the question. Didn't fill in the gaps he didn't know existed. That wasn't my role anymore. On my last day, there was no meeting. No speech. No acknowledgement beyond a short email from HR. Wishing Michael success in his future endeavors. That was it. 13 years. Reduced to a sentence. I packed my bag the same way I did every evening. Nothing dramatic. No one stopped me on the way out. No last-minute realization. No sudden urgency. Just normal. I walked past the conference rooms, the desks, the screens. Everything looked the same. Stable. As I reached the exit, I paused for a second. Not to look back. Just to register the moment. Then I walked out. No noise. No reaction. Just gone. The first message came 3 days after I left. Not from management. From someone I used to work with on the operations floor. Hey, quick question. Are you still reachable? I looked at it for a second before replying. What's up? There was a short delay. Then, seeing some delays in batch processing. Nothing major. Just different. Different. I knew exactly what that meant. What kind of delays? I asked. He explained. Small timing issues. Slight mismatches between systems. Nothing breaking yet. Just not clean. I could see the problem in my head before he finished typing. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know. Because I wasn't there anymore. Have you checked the sync intervals? I asked. Yeah. Looks fine. Of course it did. On the surface, everything always looked fine. All right, I said. Keep monitoring it. That was it. No deep dive. No stepping in. Just distance. Over the next few days, I heard more. Nothing official. Just quiet messages. Questions. Small concerns. The kind of things that used to come directly to me before they became visible. Now, they were moving through the system. Slower. Less certain. Ryan tried to manage it through structure. Meetings. Updates. Status reports. From what I heard, he was handling it well on paper. Tracking issues. Assigning tasks. Following process. But the system wasn't built to be managed that way. It needed understanding. Not just coordination. That difference doesn't show up immediately. It builds. One small delay becomes two. Two become a pattern. Patterns become questions. And questions become pressure. By the end of the first week, clients had started noticing. Nothing serious yet. Just inconsistencies. Slight delays in response times. Minor errors that needed correction. The kind of things I used to catch before they reached that point. I heard about one call in particular. A client asking, "Is something different on your end?" That question matters more than any report. Because once a client feels a difference, it means the system has already changed. And once they start asking, they start watching. I stayed quiet, focused on my new role, new systems, new structure. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one holding something together behind the scenes. It felt lighter. Not easier, just clearer. But even from a distance, I could see what was happening. Not because I was involved, because I had seen it before. Many times, just never all at once. The company still believed it was manageable. From their perspective, nothing had failed. No major outages. No lost contracts. Just small issues. And small issues are easy to ignore. Until they're not. Because systems like that don't break loudly. They drift. And once they start drifting without someone correcting them early, the direction only goes one way. I put my phone down that night and didn't check it again. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood something simple. It wasn't mine to fix anymore. And whatever happened next wasn't going to be immediate, but it was going to be clear. By the second week, the tone changed. You could hear it in the messages. They were no longer casual questions. They were sharper, shorter, more urgent. What changed? That question showed up more than once. Not just internally, from clients. That's when I knew it had moved past small issues. Because clients don't ask that unless something feels off in a real way. I didn't need to be inside the system to understand what was happening. I had seen the pattern too many times. The delays weren't being corrected early anymore. They were stacking. Small mismatches turning into timing gaps. Timing gaps turning into processing errors. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to slow things down. And when systems slow down, money slows down with them. The first real sign came from Crestline, not the new company I had joined. The old account I used to support. They reduced their weekly volume. Quietly. No announcement. Just a drop. 10% at first. Then more. That's how clients react when they're unsure. They don't leave immediately. They pull back. Test. Watch. And if things don't improve, they move. I heard about it through someone I still trusted. They're asking for stability guarantees now, he told me. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Of course they were. Because they used to have it. They just didn't know what it took. Inside the company, leadership started noticing the numbers. Weekly reports didn't look as clean. Margins tightening. Throughput slightly lower. Nothing dramatic on its own. But together, enough to raise concern. Emergency meetings started. Not public ones. Closed rooms. Senior leadership only. Ethan was in those now. Ryan too. Try to explain what was happening. Try to connect things that didn't make sense on paper. Because on paper, everything was still operational. Systems running. Processes active. Teams engaged. But the outcomes weren't matching. That's the hardest problem to explain. When nothing is broken, but nothing is right either. I heard they started pulling logs. Digging into timelines. Looking for a clear cause. There wasn't one. Because it wasn't one thing. It was a chain. Small corrections that used to happen automatically, now missing. Decisions that used to be made instantly, now delayed. Patterns that used to be recognized early, now unnoticed. That kind of gap doesn't show up as a failure. It shows up as drift. And drift is hard to measure until it becomes loss. By midweek, another client escalated, larger than the first. They didn't reduce volume. They questioned the contract. Service levels. Reliability. That's when things get serious. Because once contracts are questioned, revenue isn't just slowing. It's at risk. The number came in by the end of the week. 40%. That's how much revenue had dropped across key accounts. Not total company revenue, but the part tied directly to the systems I used to manage. 40% in 1 week. That doesn't happen because of one failure. It happens because of accumulated weakness finally becoming visible. That's when my name started coming up. At first, quietly. In conversations. In side comments. Michael used to handle this. I think he had a workaround for something like this. We should check what he documented. Then louder. More direct. Why didn't we plan for this? Who owns this now? Can we bring him back? That last question matters. Because once it gets asked, it means they understand the gap. Not fully. But enough. I got the call late Friday evening. Unknown number again. But this time, I knew exactly where it was coming from. I let it ring twice before answering. Michael. There was no introduction. Just a breath on the other end. Then a voice I recognized. Senior leadership. Different tone than before. Less polished. More real. Michael, we need to talk. Of course they did. I leaned back in my chair. Calm. Not surprised. Just ready to listen. Because everything that was happening now was always going to happen. Not because I left, because of what they chose to ignore while I was there. And now, they were finally seeing it. Michael, we're seeing some issues on the operations side. That's how he started. Careful, measured, like if he chose the right words, it would sound smaller than it was. I didn't interrupt. I let him continue. Nothing we can't fix, he added quickly. But we could use your insight. Insight. That was a new word. Before it was structure, alignment, stability. Now is insight. What kind of issues? I asked, even though I already knew. He explained. Delays, client concerns, revenue impact. He didn't say 40%, but he didn't need to. You could hear in the way he paused between sentences, in the way he chose what not to say. We'd like you to come in, he said. Take a look. Help us stabilize things. Stabilize. There it was again. Same word, different weight. I stood up and walked over to the window. My new office overlooked a smaller operations floor. Different systems, different team, but something about it felt grounded. Clear. What exactly are you asking? I said. A pause. Then, consulting. Short term, just until we get things back on track. Short term. I almost smiled. 13 years, reduced to short term. Compensation wouldn't be an issue, he added quickly. Of course it wouldn't. Not now. I stayed quiet for a moment. Not to think, just to let the moment settle. Because this wasn't about the offer. It was about the shift. The same company that told me for 3 years that my role was aligned was now asking me to fix what they couldn't understand. And they were willing to pay for it. Now, not next year. Not after review cycles. Now, I'm going to be direct, I said. Go ahead. You had 3 years to adjust my compensation when I was preventing these problems. Silence. No interruption. No defense. You chose not to, I continued. That was your decision. Another pause. Careful breathing on the other end. I understand that, he said. That was new too. Understanding. Not explanation. Not justification. Just acceptance. But right now, we need help, he added. Of course they did. I looked out the window for a few seconds, not thinking about them, thinking about myself, about the late nights, the calls, the years of making sure nothing broke, without anyone asking how, without anyone understanding why it worked. And then I thought about where I was now, a place where the work was seen, where problems were discussed before they became failures, where I wasn't the invisible layer holding everything together. That clarity matters. I'm not available to come back, I said. Calm. No emotion. Just fact. Another silence. Longer this time. We can be flexible, he said. Remote. Advisory. Whatever works for you. They were adjusting now. Quickly. The same way they never did before. I appreciate that, I said. But I'm focused on my current role. That was the truth. Not an excuse. A decision. Understood, he replied. And for the first time in the entire conversation, he sounded like he meant it. We ended the call shortly after. No tension, no argument, just closure. I put my phone down and sat there for a minute. Quiet, still, not satisfied, not proud, just steady, because this was never about revenge. It was about reality. And reality had finally shown up. Not in a meeting, not in a report, in results. 40%. That's what it took for them to see what I had been holding together. And by then, it was already gone. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the systems in front of me. Different company, different structure, but the same principle. Work has value. Understanding has value. And if the place you're in doesn't recognize it, someone else will. You don't force it. You don't argue for it forever. At some point, you let the system run without you. And whatever happens after that speaks for itself.